Lovely. Hi,
Excellent.
everyone. I'm Beck. I'm from the city of Stonington. Um, I'd like to start off with acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we're meeting tonight. And if you're in Stonington, that is the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung and Bunurong people of the East Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, as well as extending that to respect to any Indigenous people who might be joining tonight and all of the countries that you are all joining on. We acknowledge a living connection to country, relationship with the land, and all living things extending back thousands of years for all Indigenous people. Again, thank you so much for participating in tonight's webinar on summer pruning. It's a workshop I've been wanting to run for a really long time, so I'm very excited to be hearing from Scott tonight. It's a part of the My Smart Garden program, so if you haven't heard of us before, we're a collaborative program between 9 Melbourne Metro councils, and we have aims to help residents grow their own food, increase resilience in a changing climate, reduce waste and water use. A little bit of housekeeping. Please mute yourself, but we love questions, so feel free to pop questions or comments into the chat box down the bottom. We're recording tonight's presentation, so you'll be able to watch it back. Sometimes it does take us a little while to get that up onto our My Smart Garden website, but it'll definitely be there. And Scott has kindly going to provide us with some notes as well. So don't stress too much if you can't keep track of everything that's shared tonight. So now I will present our facilitator for tonight, Scott Hitchins. He is a passionate horticulturalist, a permaculture expert, and a founding member of the Werribee Park Heritage Orchard. So I think we're in really good hands to be talking about fruit tree pruning tonight. Scott also shared with me that the Fruit Tree Festival is on this Sunday in Werribee at the Heritage Orchard. So if you live in the West or you're interested in spending the day over there, feel free to head on over. There's details on their website and their Facebook page. And I think there's going to be a bunch of presentations, and there's also going to be fruit trees for sale, which is pretty exciting. So,
At
Scott,
very
I'll
reasonable prices.
pass over to you.
Hi, folks. Thanks for coming along tonight. I'm going to finish that ad for Werribee Park Heritage Orchard because we're all volunteers. Um, we're there on Sunday till about 3 o'clock from 10 o'clock. Fruit trees are around the 35 and lower mark for all heritage varieties. And people come from not just all over Victoria, but from interstate, particularly collectors and so on who are after those rare varieties. So do come see these, and there is entertainment and food trucks and that sort of thing as well. Now on to the more serious stuff. I'll get their share function going. Share, go. All
That
right,
looks great.
it's up and running. So as Beck said, you can pop your questions into the chat, and I'll try to answer them at the end of each slide mostly. And if they're going to be covered a bit later on, I'll let you know that as well, rather than go through it twice. Okay. Now I was going to move things around a bit because it always ends up that I'm looking at myself when I'm trying to look at the screen on these things. Okay. So summer pruning. Growing up, we were all told that those of us who have grown up, anyway, I sort of have, we're all told that you prune your deciduous fruit trees in winter when they're dormant. And that advice comes to Australia mostly via Britain, where it does get cold enough, as it does in the US and many other countries in the Northern Hemisphere, where it does get cold enough that the trees go completely dormant in winter. However, in Melbourne and further north of here, and even Tasmania to a fair degree, the trees don't go completely dormant. And you may have noticed this if you've got apple trees, that they'll have some random new leaves and some random blossoms, all that throughout the year. So what happens is if you prune in winter, then you're encouraging at the start of spring, you get a whole lot of really whippy water shoots. And if you look on this picture here, you can see them all reaching there for the sky. And those very vertical shoots will not produce fruit. And eventually you'll just cut them off. So essentially what happens if you prune in winter, then you're growing a lot of wood. And unless you're a beaver, you probably don't want that. And that you'll end up cutting that off and throwing it away. So summer pruning is about getting the energy of the tree to go into plenty of fruit, but also good quality fruit, rather than into growth that you're just going to throw away. All right. There is some situations where you will prune in winter, but I'll come to them. And there'll be people here who don't agree with me. That's absolutely fine. If you have a question about it, I will clarify further if you like. Just on the pruning points too, as a general rule, we prune to an outward facing bud, but that's a general term. Just we prune to a bud that's heading in the direction that we want the branch to grow. Any questions yet, Beck?
None yet.
Oh, guys, come on, you're too slow. You'll get there. Okay. All right, just some terminology to get us started. Uh, so water shoots, I just talked about, they're those long whippy branches that aren't of much use. This will be in the notes, so I'm not going to read it to you. I will skip through it. But one of the key things to recognise with fruit tree growth is at the tip of each upward facing branch, there is an apical bud. Apical just means it's at the top. And that produces hormones or reacts to hormones, plant hormones, that tell the plant to reach for the sky. The fact is, in your backyard, for your backyard fruit trees, they shouldn't really be any taller than you can reach standing flat on your feet and reaching your arm straight up, which you can't see on video. But if you're a shorter person, you'll have shorter trees, but they're really not much difference in size. If you don't keep them down to that, then you can't net them, you can't inspect them properly, prune them properly, pick them, protect them from birds and insects and all that sort of stuff. So it is worth doing. It's also worth remembering too that in a backyard situation, we're not trying to uh, grow 40 kilos of Granny Smith or something like that that are already on one day. So we're not trying to grow quantity, we're trying to have room for variety. So the more trees you can fit in your backyard and the other things underneath them, around them and growing up them and all those sort of things like vines and herbs and berries and all that sort of stuff, the more you can fit in, it may make some of the trees produce a little less when if they get slightly shaded at times, but ultimately you'll end up with more and more varied produce over a much longer part of the year, ideally all year. That's what we all try to work to. So apical dominance is something that reaches for the sky. What we want to do is reduce that dominance so we get more horizontal growth. Now, other terminology, the scion is grafted onto a rootstock. So if you look at this citrus graft here, this is the rootstock, and and that'll be something like trifoliata or some of the others. You'll get used to me doing that when I press too hard. And then that's had a bud grafted onto the side there, and that's taken off. Now, this bit, the scion, that contains the genetics that give you the variety. So if this was a Eureka lemon, that bit's Eureka lemon, and it shoots on from there. So everything above that is Eureka lemon, which is a cutting of a cutting of a cutting of a cutting of the original Eureka lemon or Granny Smith or whatever it is. The rootstock, generally rootstocks these days do their main thing. They tend to make the tree a little bit smaller, and we use the term dwarf, as in dwarf fruit trees, but in the retail nurseries, they use dwarf to talk about miniatures, so it gets a little confusing. So a dwarf apple tree, for example, can still get to 3 or 4 meters if we let it, but it will fruit in 3 years instead of about 7. So be clear on the difference between dwarf and miniature when you're purchasing trees. And you can see over on this, looks like it's a plum tree of some sort, I think. We've got the scion, which is the variety, the rootstock, and there's your graft union. That little ugly mark down there, that becomes harder and harder to see in most cases as the tree gets older. It's also important that anything that grows from below that graft, that you do remove it because it will be more vigorous and it'll take over your tree. And most of the rootstock don't produce any edible fruit. Some do, but it's never going to be the variety that you've grafted onto it. Okay. Also remember too, some trees won't have a graft, and they're usually things like well, figs are rarely grafted, pomegranates, um, medlars, quite a few others. Um, and if they don't need to be grafted, that's also a good hint to you that you can grow them from cuttings. So you don't have to buy them. You just find a friend who's got a nice variety and you take some cuttings and pot them up. Any questions, Beck?
Oh, we've had a lot come in.
Oh, good.
None on rootstock or suckers or anything, but are you happy to listen to them anyway?
Yep.
Okay. Winifred is wondering about her peach tree, which still has leaves. Should we prune them now?
Yes, but we'll come to peaches later.
Lovely. Lee is saying if your tree is already much taller than you can reach, would you suggest cutting it back to a manageable height?
Yes, if the tree's in good health. And what we generally recommend is take down, if you look, pretend you're looking down on the tree from above, divide that visually into quarters and take off 1/4 each season, apart from winter
Mm.
when it's dormant. Now, the good thing about that is you take off the first quarter and the tree copes with it and starts to put new shoots out from the branch stump, then you know it's going to work and so you can continue. But it also means over that time that you're still going to get some fruit.
And Rupa's wondering about other fruit trees like pomegranates and feijoas.
Yep, they're in the miscellaneous group, which I will come to. But basically, it's no, I'll come to the whole thing. We'll get confusing if I start on that now.
Okay. Janice is wondering if I pruned before harvest and now her plums are finished or their plums are finished, should I prune again?
If it needs it, it's um, generally the recommendation is that you do your summer pruning. And when I say summer pruning, it'll be summer, autumn, depending on the fruit and how and when it ripens. Um, Generally, we do that pruning at least a couple of weeks after harvest, just to give the tree a bit of time to recover. Um, Remember too, we're getting feedback from someone.
Sorry,
Um,
just muted them.
Remember too, no, now I've got to remember to before I interrupted myself. Um,
It's okay, maybe we can come back to it,
we'll
or
come
maybe
back to that. Yeah,
it'll pop up during the
yeah, it will. It'll
presentation.
be on. It is on one of the later slides.
Evergreens, lemons, and kumquats. We're going to come to that later as
Yeah,
well.
different group, but that we will address. Yep,
Fruit trees are quite tall. How much do I prune off? I think we established that.
yep.
Heather's wondering, oh, there's lots of questions. My
All right,
apples still have fruit ripening, and we're looking at are we looking at mid-autumn for pruning those apples?
that's fine.
Yep.
Yep.
My kaffir lime has just produced heaps of branches with thick thorns. Sorry, with huge thorns. Do I prune them off?
You certainly can, but that just check it's not rootstock because a lot of the rootstock are very thorny.
Mm.
I know kaffir lime can be a bit thorny too, but just check it's not coming from below the graft. And if that's the case, you certainly need to remove all of that.
Jason's wondering if there's such a thing as over pruning. My lemon tree has lots of greenery but no lemons.
Usually that means too much nitrogen and other foods, but particularly nitrogen. And it's not so much, look, particularly with lemons, which we will come to, you can prune the living daylights out of them back to a stump and they'll still come back.
And Jason, we have I'm sure it's still on our website, a recording specifically about lemons and citrus. So that might be a good one for you to have a look at too. Joy is wondering, is it too late to summer prune my apricot tree?
Definitely not. The best time to prune apricots, though, is if the leaves start to yellow, then get onto it as a priority. If you because apricots can be a bit susceptible to fungal diseases. Pardon my dog barking in the background. Someone dared to walk past our house. Because apricots are susceptible to fungal diseases, then um, if you prune them while they're still actively growing, in other words, when they've got their leaves on, they can heal themselves better rather than doing it when they're dormant or semi-dormant. So I would tend to give them a bit of a priority if they're yellowing off now, if you've got to pick which trees to do first. And I would also, if you're doing when you're doing your organically acceptable sprays for curly leaf on your peaches, hit up your cherries and apricots with the same stuff, the same copper-based spray.
And Winifred is wondering about her plum that's got lots of suckers. What should I do?
Cut them off
Excellent.
and
And Jeanette,
persist.
oh, sorry, continue.
And persist. Just keep cutting them off. If they're from below the graft, you've got to keep cutting them. They will take over.
Janelle's wondering that someone said if you prune wrong that you kill the tree.
Only if you prune with a chainsaw or an axe. It's really, really rare that happens. I mean, essentially, you'll have to cut the tree down or at least cut it below the graft.
And we'll do a couple more. Jeez, there's a lot of questions.
I'm going to move on
Okay, we'll
because we will
pause
run
there
out of
then.
time. We'll get to them as they become either answered
Relevant.
or relevant.
Sure.
Okay, but I do appreciate all the questions,
Thanks,
guys.
everyone. Yeah.
But we've got a lot to get through, so keep the questions coming. But I hope to answer a lot of them before you get to ask them. Okay, so when do you prune in winter? Obviously in winter, but why? Well, the main thing with pruning in winter is remember I said it's going to cause a lot of growth that's of no use to you. It's going to be causing vigorous growth. That's good if it's a new tree. So if you've bought yourself a new tree, or if you buy one at Werribee Park Heritage Orchard on the weekend, or at some big green shed for a ridiculous price at another time, and plant them, the first one, usually 1 to 2, sometimes as long as 3 years, you do prune to establish the shape of the tree, usually into a vase, so 4 main branches, and then branching further and further. Um, the old orchardy guys always use the phrase, which I have to doctor slightly, is ankle, knee, chest, forehead, which so you grass about ankle height, at about knee height, the tree branches, you encourage to branch out, and there are ways to encourage it to do that. I'll come to, and then at chest height, it should each of those branches out further, and a head height branching out again. Okay, because branching means more sites where fruiting can occur or where fruiting bodies can develop. So once you've established the shape of the tree, that's when you switch to your summer pruning. Also in wood, you can do the 3Ds, and that's cleaning up and clipping off anything that's dead, diseased, or damaged. Okay, and see on the one on the right there, we've got some lichen growing on the tree. That's a good thing, not a problem at all. It just means you've got relatively clean air where you are. So the thicker the lichen, the better. And note here, avoid pruning citrus in winter. Now, if you prune your citrus now, so the pruning we're talking about now, deciduous trees. If you prune your citrus now, you'll encourage a flush of fresh green tender growth, and it'll be attacked by leaf miners and other things because it's nice and tender and yummy. But also, too, it's likely to get frost damage because it'll still be quite tender when the frosts start. So citrus, which are an evergreen, what you do is you wait till after the last frost to prune them. And remember too, most of your citrus, I'll talk more about citrus, but most of your citrus are going to be fruiting over winter anyway. That's when the majority of them fruit. Okay, because in that picture there, there's some gall wasp infecting that. Once the little pinholes are showing up in that, it's too late to cut it open, so don't bother or prune it off. But if it hasn't hatched yet, when you're checking over the trees, get a sharp knife or a potato peeler and cut them right open on one side. If they're just on small branches that don't matter, cut them straight off. But if you need to preserve that branch, just open up each of those swellings and they'll die screaming. Quick questions.
Okay. How aggressive do you prune back vines like passion fruit and grapes?
Okay, passion fruit, take them back by once they're established, take them back in depth, from the fence out to you, take them back by about a third after fruiting. And grapevines, depending on how you're growing them, you establish your basic structure, which might be up your pergola and then across on a few lines. And then once you've got your structure in place, you prune back to that structure, just leaving a couple of buds on each piece coming off. And that'll easily cover your whole pergola again if that's how you're growing your grapes. You don't have to prune grapes. If you're trying to cover a wall to get lots of fruit, make the wall green and keep the sun off the side of your house, you can just keep tucking and tying the branches back. It's not compulsory to do it, but it does work best if you just develop the main structure and then prune back to that every year.
And are you going to talk later about pruning by sort of age? Someone's talking about how to prune in the first year of their
Well,
tree.
I've just sort of covered the shaping 1 to 3,
Yep.
years 1 to 3,
Yep.
and then it's all the same on from there.
Okay.
I'm not going to go much into developing that shape, but I will talk about it in some of the later slides.
Lovely. Monique's wondering about fig trees. When are they best pruned?
I'll come to them.
Lovely. Nurseries that specialize in miniature fruit trees. Is there a miniature apricot? There certainly is.
There is, yes. We don't stock many miniatures at the orchard. But a lot of in the retail sector, there are pretty much miniatures of everything out there these days. The only miniatures I've got is 3 flying dragon rootstock in pots, which I just keep grafting on any citrus I just happen to get hold of, just
Cool.
because I can.
And Lavissa, this is a great question. She's wondering, will you show some photos of how to prune? She says, I don't understand how to see what's a 1-year-old wood, which I think is a great question.
Yeah, that's
Um,
a peachy question, that one.
mm,
Quite literally, 1 year old wood. Yes, I will go through all the different parts and I've got some nice close-up photos for you. So let's
Lovely.
move on.
Yeah, let's.
Okay, and here they are, the pruning groups. Just let me shift the photos out of the screen out of the way. So these are the main groups, and the first 3 are by far the most important because they're the ones that have separate things to remember. So your pome fruit, which is apples, pears, nashi, and quince, but in brackets, I'll explain soon. They develop fruiting spurs, pictures coming up, and those spurs last for the life of the tree. So each spring they'll put out flowers, blossoms, and then those that get pollinated will develop into fruit. Okay, and some of the apples and pears and nashi are also tip bearing, which means the fruit is on the end of the branch, but usually it's only partially so. They'll still have spurs, except for quince, which are all tip bearing. I'll come to it. Now, all your stone fruit except your peaches and nectarines. Nectarines, by the way, are just bald peaches. They are the same thing. They're just a mutation without the fluff. Okay, so your stone fruit, apricots, plums, including the European varieties and the Japanese varieties of plums, your cherries, almonds, they all rely on cluster buds. This diagram is in your notes, in the notes that I'll send, by the way. Now, cluster buds are a bit like spurs. They don't last as long, but they do last for many years. And the way they came up with the name for cluster buds is they're a cluster of buds. So it's not all that hard to remember. Now, peaches, they stand out as the one big different thing because they fruit on 1 year old wood. I'm going to go through all of these in more detail. Okay, so these fruit on 1 year old wood, so you have to prune to encourage the 1 year old wood. Right? So what will be 1 year next year when we're doing the pruning now is what we want to encourage. Figs, citrus, fruit, everything else, they don't have specific fruiting sites. So if you prune them back to a bud or a pair of buds, then you're going to encourage branching. Branching means fruit. As long as you're getting enough air circulation through them and not having problems with fungal diseases, then the more branching, the better. Okay, so there's no site that you're on that tree that you're trying to preserve to get fruit next year. But don't forget what citrus we're doing in spring. Figs you can do now. Some of you will be aware that figs produce 2 crops a year. And one of the pruning things I do for figs is after the first crop in usually about mid to late summer, I'll go through and just snap off all the little green tips on all the branches, and that'll encourage branching. And that will give me bigger crops on the next lot coming along. I've had one heck of a year for figs this year. They're just dripping off the tree. Mind you, I cheat a bit. One of my fig trees, even though it's shorter than me, has got something like 15 varieties on it and still going, just because I can. We have, I think we're up to about 70 or 80 varieties of figs down at the orchard. But remember, you can grow figs from cutting. So if a friend's got a fig that you love the taste of, grab a few bits about 20, 30 centimeters long, stick them all in one pot to see. And when one of them grows, you can repot that and actually put it out in the garden. If they all grow, give them to your friends and they'll all say, what a wonderful gardener you are. How do you do it? Okay, I'm not going to stop for questions on this one because they're all things that are coming up. Okay, so in the picture here, so I'm looking at apples, pears, and quince. So in this picture here, some of the key things. This wrinkly little bugger here, that's the spurs. And they look, with small variations, they look much the same on your apples and your pears and your quince. So they're the areas that you don't want to damage. So don't send kids out to pick apples and pears unless they're old enough and smart enough to know not to go breaking those spurs off. You can grow new spurs, but ideally you want to keep these spurs producing for the life of the tree, and they'll get more and more gnarly. They'll often branch off to produce more spurs, whereas these buds here, they're just single buds that are going shooting off, and there's our apical bud at the top. And I'll tell you a little trick for apples and pears too. This apical bud at the top here, when you're pruning, instead of just cutting back to the next bud, come down a bit below that bud there and cut above this bud. So we're leaving this section of wood here that's above our last bud, but finishes in nothing. So finishes at a dead end. Now, what happens there is we've removed the apical bud, and we've also triggered hormones here that because there's no leaf to draw the sap up, this little piece here will die back, and that'll send hormones into the tree saying, my God, we're going to die, we've got to produce children. And that'll encourage further development of spurs on the rest of this branch. So we call that undercutting. It does need to be done when the tree's in active growth like now. So rather than just take the tip off to get it to branch a bit more, because we want to encourage this to produce spurs, we'll come back to here, and then next year when we're cleaning up, we'll just snip that piece off, back to some green wood that'll heal itself. Okay, if you want that branch to get nice and long and tall to reach the height of the tree you want, if that's the function of that branch, fine, don't take the tip off. But most of the rest of the tree, you want it to come to a halt eventually. So all its energy and nutrients are going into fruit and leaf, particularly fruit, and not into bits of wood that you're going to snip off and have a hard time getting rid of. All right. Do we have any questions specifically on the on dealing with the spurs
No,
and the undercuts?
not at this stage.
Okay. This is a quince here, and as you can sort of see there, there's no spur. The branch just goes directly into the fruit. So that's a tip bearer, and there are some apples that are partially tip bearers, and a small number of pears as well. But the majority of apples which you buy will be exclusively spur bearing. Over on this side, while I move the screen again for me, over on this side, so this is a spur here, and we've had some blossoms which have been pollinated, and you can see on this particular spur, we've had 3 of those blossoms successfully pollinated. Now, if we leave all 3 of those fruit on, regardless of what they are in most cases, if they were cherries, you wouldn't worry about it. But for most fruit, including peaches, plums, apricots, apples and pears, and all that, if we leave all those on, we're going to get 3 small fruit with poor flavour. If we cut 2 of those off, we're going to get 1 slightly larger fruit, which, and size isn't everything, I keep telling myself. It's important that you'll get better flavoured fruit. So all those flavour compounds, ketones, aldehydes, all those other nice scientific name things, they won't be there in such abundance. So it is important to thin your fruit, and you do that when the fruit's about pea size.
Scott, we do
Okay.
have a question. Pam's
Yep.
wondering, she's got an apple that's 5 years old
Yep.
and not really getting any fruit. Do you think it's from bad pruning?
Probably not, unless you're I usually tell the story about the number of people who have said to me they got Jim's mowing or somewhere like that to prune the fruit tree. And they say, "Do you know how to prune trees?" And he goes, "Yeah." And he makes it a very pretty shape and cuts off all these ugly bits. So don't get your lawnmower guy or girl to prune your fruit trees unless you're really sure that they do understand fruit trees. They're great at making nice shapes. They're not good at understanding and preserving the fruiting bodies. And that's why you're here tonight, so you can do it yourself. The reason the apple may not be fruiting, 5 years, you would expect a small amount of fruit by now. It may not have a pollinator in the area. Uh, Apples need a pollinator in almost all cases, as do most, but not all other fruit. Um, and it just simply means that you can either plant a pollinator in your yard, or you can graft a branch off one of them. And if you see us at the orchard, or even just go to our website, you should be able to find the pollinator for your variety. If you type in the chat what variety is, I'll see if I can give you an answer. But just to be clear, though, Granny Smith pollinates nearly every apple.
It's a pink lady.
Then definitely Granny Smith is the pollinator. However, in established suburbs, you will generally find there's no need for a pollinator for your apples, because someone within a circle of about 2 kilometres will have a compatible apple as well. And 2 kilometres is about how far the bees fly. So if you've had fruit for years and suddenly it's stopped, it can be because the old guy down the road died and his kids sold off the house and subdivided it for units, and now there's no trees left on it. Okay. So while you're waiting for a branch to develop, you can also cut a branch off someone else's Granny Smith or Jonathan and just pop that fresh in the tree in a jar of water, and it'll do the job. But I think you'll find, as long as the tree's healthy, that it will fruit more and more. Any questions?
Someone's wondering about coddling moth. I'm not sure if we'll touch on that tonight, but we've definitely got organic pest and disease workshops. I'm not sure whether they touch on it though, but it
I
might be
will touch
worthwhile
a
having a
little
look at.
if we get to my extra time slides.
Okay,
There will be some info on that.
lovely.
Okay. All right. The next group, plums, cherries, apricots, and almonds, the cluster buds group. And there's our cluster buds. Okay, so again, like the spurs, each of those is going to produce a flower, and each of those, if you don't break it off, will persist. And on a piece of branch like that, see, we've got a well-established cluster of buds on the top. And not only is that giving us fruit, but it's also stopping the branch from taking off and growing longer than we want it to. So if we prune this cluster off, that would stimulate this bud to take off and give us a longer branch, which sometimes we may want. Sorry, just trying to move these photos again. Some nights they really get me. Okay, so you can have a look on the branch here where the arrow is. That's where it was pruned back to last year, and it was pruned back to a bud which has developed further. If we prune back to here instead, then we're probably going to bring it to a halt because we've got these clusters here and here and no other buds to overtake it. So we've still got to have buds at the end of the branch, and just to draw the sap, but we want to use our clusters or spurs to slow the tree down to become a fruit producing monster rather than a growth monster. And again, as that fruit develops, you need to thin it out. Cherries you don't need to thin, and almonds, which are in the stone fruit family, weirdly enough, you also don't need to thin. Now, the reason behind that is if you leave, say, all the peaches on your tree rather than thinning them out, and some of my fruit trees, I'll remove up to 75% of the tiny fruit, just to get good sized stuff. Um, I've gone brain dead again. What was I talking about, Beck?
Sorry, I don't know. I was answering a question about aphids.
All right, sorry. So we yes, with thinning. That's where I was. Sorry, folks. It's just one of those days. So when you're thinning out almonds, you don't need to thin because I was talking, and the peach. So if you leave all your peaches on, you'll end up with a whole lot of fruit that have full-size stones and just a few millimeters of fruit over the top of them. And for most of your soft fruit, that's a problem because you don't want a full-size seed, you want a full-size fruit. However, with almonds, the seed is the bit you're eating. So if you've grown almonds, that outer green shell, the fluffy green shell that eventually splits open, that is the fruit. It's the seed inside that you want. So you don't need to thin almonds either. All right. So we're establishing our fruiting bodies on our stone fruit and our pomes. We're establishing them and we're trying to make sure they don't get broken off because not only will they produce fruit, this will help us control the growth of our tree to stop it from taking off. And these pictures are all in the notes as well. Okay, so key thing I want you to take away tonight, we've still got plenty to go, but key thing is this table and the associated diagrams. So you very quickly do come to understand when you're actually doing it yourself, which bits to cut off and which not. And of course, if you cut to a single bud, that's going to take off in the direct, and if it's pointing in the direction you want it to go, great, that's what you want to happen. But if you're trying to keep the tree back, come back to your fruiting structures, and that'll put more of the tree's energy into fruit instead of into growth. All right, here we are. Peaches, nectarines, and 1-year-old wood, if I can keep it from changing. Okay, so peaches and nectarines, I'm just going to say peaches from here on, same thing. They fruit on 1-year-old wood. Now you can see the colour of all three pieces here, green grading through to red. That's your 1-year-old wood. That's the wood that when you're pruning this year, that's the wood that you want to maintain for next year. But of course there are exceptions. If it's old and gnarly, it's fruited, it's done, either cut it off or leave it to start to produce other side branches, which will produce the year after's 1-year-old wood. Okay. But if these 1-year-old branches are too thin towards the ends, then cut them off. Cut them back to some buds. For example, this triple bud here that I'll talk about in a minute, cut back to these so that you're not trying to fill a swimming pool with a garden hose. Okay, cut back to some thicker wood, about thin chopstick size as a minimum, so that you've got a big enough hose width pumping all the nutrients into your fruiting buds. You follow that? Pop me a question if you're stuck on that one. So we want to maintain this for next year's 1-year-old wood, but if it's too thin and whippy, it's not going to support and feed the fruit. So that's what we're aiming for. Now, there'll be people sitting there saying, oh, I've never pruned my peach tree and it always keeps fruiting. Yep, it will for quite a while, maybe 20 years. But the problem is that fruit's always going to be on the outer perimeters of the tree because that's where your wood growth is continuing. And eventually you'll reach a stage where the tree's fully mature and it will gradually stop producing fruit nearly altogether. Okay, so you need to prune yearly and early in the life of the tree so that you're setting it up to produce this sort of wood continuously. You don't need a huge tree. You just need to encourage the production of that 1-year-old wood. Okay, so
So, Scott, the older wood would be a brown, like
it'll be
a
like,
brown color.
yeah, it'll have recognizable bark on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, like this one over on the side you can barely see there. Okay, so it's this fresh green turning to red stuff is what you're after, of a reasonable thickness. Now, if you've got a whole lot of tiny stuff coming off a point of a branch, prune most of that off. Okay, because you're just giving yourself more tiny fruit to thin and you're sharing out the nutrients amongst more and more smears of fruit over full-size seeds. So cut back. It's not just about producing big fruit, it's about the quality of the fruit, as I said. But remember too that if you don't follow these instructions exactly, the fruit police will not come round to your house and arrest you. These are guidelines. They're ideas to get you thinking in the right direction, so you'll start to do things yourself. It doesn't mean you can't cut off that branch that pokes you in the bum every time you bend over to pick parsley. And it also doesn't mean you can't cut off the branch that's in the way of the kid's trampoline or something like that. Okay, so they're guidelines. We mostly stick to them, but trees are never perfect, particularly in a backyard. If you read up the books, they'll say, oh, put X number of meters between each tree. Yeah, that's fine if you're going to drive a tractor between them on a commercial orchard. Jam them in. Most of my fruit trees are about 2 meters apart at the most, and there's other stuff growing in between most of them, as well as in many cases, chickens living underneath them, doing all the weeding and manuring and bug catching and all that sort of stuff. So these are general rules that are made to be broken, but they give you an idea of what you're trying to achieve. Now, when you're pruning your peaches, if we cut back to this single bud here, that'll take off as a woody growth. And in some cases, that's what we want to happen. However, if we cut back to this triple bud here, like a millimetre or two above it, then one of these buds, and it'll be most likely the middle one, is going to blossom. So not only will it produce fruit, but also in its fruiting, it's going to inhibit that branch from taking off. So coming back to a triple instead of a single is going to help contain your tree and produce fruit rather than coming back to the single, which will give you more growth. Now, in some cases, depending on the type, the variety of peach or the age of the peach, it can be quite hard to find triples. Some varieties are just covered with them. Um, if you prune back to a double, you've got a greater chance than a single. And if prune back to a single, well, cross your fingers. Okay, so but look, relax. Sometimes they are hard to see and hard to find, and sometimes they're just not there. But they will be eventually.
And is now a good time to do this pruning on a peach and nectarine?
Absolutely. Yeah. If you've picked the fruit, which in most cases you would have, or some of the ladies, late ones, like Golden Queen and so on, even though some people are picking them now, they may stay a little bit to go. But yeah, they are a summer pruning fruit. Okay. So remember, we're encouraging this wood that's going to be 1 year old, and we're encouraging our triple buds and cutting back to them. How are we going for questions?
Yeah, good. We've had a few come in. Lavissa is wondering with the 1 year old wood pruning, does
Yeah.
it make the tree wider and wider? She's keen to control the growth.
Um, it won't if you're pruning back to triples. If you prune back to singles, then those singles are going to grow in the direction they're pointing. So if you want to keep it narrow, and look, trees will produce more if they're wide, but how much do you need? If you need the space to fit in other things, that's absolutely fine. So you can prune back to triples as much as you can, and where you're pruning back to a single, make sure it's not heading out horizontally, but will tend to head upwards. Like this nice little tightly tucked one in here, that's very unlikely to go that way. It'll probably go that way.
Mm.
And if it goes the wrong way, then come out to the next bud that's facing the way you want it to go and prune back to that.
And Pam's wondering, can you just get a dud tree? Her nectarine doesn't do much, but the peach is excellent. It's a beauty.
Look, it does happen, but it's usually the health of the tree that's the issue. Um, Peaches and nectarines don't need a pollinator except in a couple of very rare cases. So it's not a matter of pollination. However, fruit grown from seed, so if it's not grafted, fruit from seed will sometimes not fruit, but sometimes it'll be absolutely fantastic and you've got a new variety. But I pulled out a nectarine seedling from the compost. I planted it. It grew into a lovely tree. It fruited, and it never ever produced edible fruit. It was all rock hard and small until it just rotted and fell off. So it can happen. You can get duds, but if they're grafted, that really shouldn't happen. It may be something else like nutrient needs. Try sprinkling a bit of wood ash around it to boost up the potassium. Wood ash,
And oh wait,
sorry,
sorry, continue.
yeah, wood ash has a lot of uses in the garden, and a source of potassium is one of them. Potassium encourages fruiting. Nitrogen encourages green growth.
Do we touch on avocados later on?
Not really. They just fall into the general category. So,
Evergreen kind of
yep. So
group.
pruning, you know, cutting back to buds to encourage branching will encourage fruiting.
Okay.
If it Just to encourage you with avocados, I have a friend in Werribee who picks 1 to 200 avocados every year off her pair of trees and has done for
Wow.
many years. So it's certainly can be done. There are supposedly there's some self-fertile avocados coming onto the market, but they're probably going to cost rather a lot. Generally, you have to plant a pair of avocados as opposed to an avocado pair. Okay, how are we going? Any more questions?
I think that's it for now, so we can move on.
Right. Okay, so we got through how to prune everything. So we had the pomes, the stone fruit, the peaches and nectarines, and then pretty much everything else falls under branching makes fruit. All right. So let's look at a few of the tools that you'll need. Now, this big bunch of tools here, if you start from a young tree, you will never need any of them except the secateurs. So if you prune early and shape early and keep pruning every summer, then you'll contain the tree for about, well, you need fairly decent secateurs. You'd probably spend about $30 to $40 on a pair that should last you all your life. Certainly they'll last me all my life. Um, and that's the only one you need. You won't need this pole saw. You may borrow one off someone to bring your tree back and hide if it's got away. You won't need hedge clippers. Loppers you may need just to pull the tree back if it's gotten away, but otherwise not. And the same with a pruning saw. So if you're looking at buying some tools, number one would be the secateurs of a fairly good quality. So those $7 pairs that you get from that large green building, forget it. You'll try to cut something as thick as your finger and the blade will snap. Okay? You can buy them, pairs that cost hundreds and hundreds of dollars. You don't need to go that far, but just buy yourself a decent pair for, as a Christmas present to yourself or something like that. Okay, and look after them well. You can actually, what you do is every year after pruning, strip them apart, undo the nuts and bolts, don't lose them, take out the spring, scrub the blades down with metho and steel wool, just fine steel wool, and get them all nice and clean so there's no disease and they're kept nice and sharp. We sharpen them with usually with a diamond stone. This is the sort I use. They're if you're secateurs are very blunt. You probably want something coarser to start you off, but if you keep them sharp, then it's just a dozen strikes with this before the beginning of every session. That's about a $24, $25 diamond stone, and it's a fine, not a super fine or a coarse. If you want this particular sort, they grade them by colour. There's an enormous amount online, but what you've got to keep in mind is that needs to be flat enough and small enough to get right into these areas here to put the edge on that blade. Okay. When you're sharpening too, remember that the vast majority of garden tools only have a bevel, a sharp side, on one side. So if you have a look at your secateurs, if you've got bypass secateurs, which most of us use, then this side you can see it's sharpened, but on the other side there is no bevel and you shouldn't be sharpening on that side. And this is about crushing branches and letting bacteria in. Most people don't use the anvil types, but some do prefer them. The key thing here is if you have any sort of build-up of gunk or wood fibre on this anvil, then you'll squash and crack the branch when you cut through them. So as long as you keep it clean, they're fine. Down at the orchard, we all carry a little bottle of metho with us, and it's not because we're closet alcoholics. It's because between every tree, so we'll finish one tree before we move to the next tree, we spray metho on our secateurs or whatever, or any of the other tools that we're using at that time, so we don't transfer disease. And one of our members is a pharmacist, and she says metho is also a better hand sanitizer than hand sanitizer, and it's made from ethanol these days from waste products from the sugar industry. So everybody wins. Some of the old timers will use diluted bleach. Add a metho and bleach. Guess which one I would rather have leak in my pocket? I very much stick with the metho. Some people put 20% water into the metho to get it to slow the evaporation, so it's got more time to kill. Myself and some others are quite sure that doesn't work because it's the evaporation that is doing the killing. So if it evaporates, it's done its job. WD-40 or something, those similar sort of things are great for oiling up your blades and the hinges and pivot points and so on. So if you lose the spring, you can buy them. For some reason, they come in a packet of 2 or 3, so you'll never get through them in your lifetime. If you break a pair of secateurs, I recommend you keep the parts, because I've got pairs of secateurs that I've rebuilt, like my rough cut anything secateurs, not my good pruning grafting ones. Um, I just, some of them are built from 2 or 3 pairs of secateurs because I do stupid things with them, like cut a piece of wire because I couldn't be bothered walking back to the tool shed. How are we going for questions on that?
Yeah, Helen's wondering, with the metho, can you have it on a rag and wipe the secateurs rather than spraying it on?
You certainly can, but when you're walking around the yard, it can be sort of quite difficult to do, and also difficult to. You got need a container that's going to keep that metho rag damp with metho.
Mm,
So it's a bit harder. And look, certainly plenty of people have done it in the past, but these days with little pump spray bottles that they're all around the house. Empty that nasty perfume down the sink and get one of those. Um, that one you got off the Mother's Day stall. Use the bottle off that. Plenty of people use small cleaning product pump sprays. I got some little ones like that from Daiso, the Japanese store, um, and we ended up buying, I don't know, about 60 of them for the orchard, and they've basically all disappeared now. But they're a great little one to have.
mm.
Okay, just a little clue though. Do write on what's in it, but don't do what my friend Crystal did. She put a name on it, so it actually said crystal meth on the bottle. True story, but
Well, no one else might touch it. Who knows? Janelle's wondering, peroxide, can that be used as well for
yep, that's
sterilizing?
fine. Peroxide's fine. Um, can be a bit harsher on your clothing, but yeah, peroxide's absolutely fine. From an environmental point of view, it's also fine. It just breaks down into water and oxygen. Um, you'll find that metho is by far the cheapest. It's sustainable. I don't know about the production of peroxide, but metho is relatively sustainable in terms of it where its materials are sourced from. And even though it's still called metho, it should be called etho now because they make it out of ethanol.
Okay.
But use whatever suits you. Again, the fruit police will not come round. Any more questions?
There's a few questions about figs, if we're going to chat about them later on.
A little bit, yeah, in the general one. Yep.
And there's actually a good question from someone who's renting. They'd love to grow some more fruit trees. They're wondering if they put it in a pot and then buried it, would they be able to dig it up and take it with them?
Um, It'd need to be a big pot. Um, Look, it is always possible.
Mm.
In heavy clay soil, it could be near impossible. It depends how much work you're willing to put into it. Sometimes, if the plan is that you'll be moving into your own place in a couple of years, then most things will stay in a pot for a couple of years without any great difficulty. 2, 3, maybe 4 years, with a bit of repotting or fresh potting mix and a bit of pruning back of roots in the top. You can get quite a few years out of them like that, and they'll be already fruiting by the time you get to your new place. Some things you're better off just biting the bullet, leaving them for the next tenant, and starting fresh. But there's no hard and fast rules. If you've got the time and the muscle energy to dig them up, make sure that you prune the top back to match about roughly with the root ball underneath, so you don't have too much green growth sucking out the liquid. Um, Keep the roots, sorry, all wrapped up and damp. And most commonly, this is done by wrapping in hessian and then wrap the hessian in plastic. But keep as much soil around that root ball as you can, and that'll make it easier. Um, and look, something like figs love being having a constricted root run. Figs will fruit better if they're kept restricted, but don't put them in a wine barrel because every 2 or 3 years you're going to have to tip them over on their side to take off the outer third, including across the base. You'll need to take off that outer third of both the potting mix and the roots. all the little fibrous roots, and then repot it with fresh potting mix. So it's just generally the outer third that you take off. And if you try to do that with a wine barrel, I guarantee you it'll fall apart every time. So if you really got your heart set on wine barrels, you can buy pots that are made to fit into wine barrels, but you're still going to have to lift that whole tree with that massive soil to get it out of there. Okay, but yeah, look, figs great. Quite a few citrus will do okay. Tahitian lime will live in a pot its whole life. Um, there's miniatures of everything available these days. So it's not sort of too hard, but when you're looking to one day get your own place, it's hard to stick to that timeline in the current economic climate, but stick them in the ground and keep your fingers crossed that they'll be great to move when you want to. Okay. Any other questions?
I think that's it for now. We'll keep moving along.
All right. Okay, espalier. And that gives me the chance to use my favourite joke. Well, it might sound like a spell that Harry Potter uses to prune his trees. I love that joke. Came up with that myself. I'm really quite chuffed that I've used it so many times. Um, espalier is essentially keeping your trees to a roughly two-dimensional shape. So rather than coming out in four directions, they just go left and right. Now, in the pictures here, um, it's up against a fence. Don't keep it at least 300-400 mils off the fence, because apples, pears, and most other fruit trees will last a lot longer than your fence. And the tradesperson who's replacing your fence won't really care much about your apple tree. Okay, this one's a pear. They're an absolute classic for doing espalier. With mine, because I've got access to the grafting material, um, on mine, every of my pear tree, every branch is a different variety of either pear or nashi. So I've got 17 varieties on that tree, 16 apples on another tree, and various other things. I'm developing a plum tree that has 8 Japanese plums on one side and 8 European plums on the other side. I'm boasting here, but just to give you an idea of the sort of stuff you can do. So if you're doing espalier, you put your tree in. Now it can be a tree with an existing variety on it, but it's often easier and cheaper just to buy a rootstock. I think we sell them for about $15, something like a bit less. Um, when that rootstock reaches the height you want, which is going to still be that, you know, 2 meter top out, high as you can reach standing flat on your feet. You either cut the tip off or you bend it horizontal as one of your side branches, and then about every 300 mil, so a foot in the old measurements, you have another branch. So each side, and you can come down to about. I usually sort of don't put them too close to the ground, so I'll start the first branch at about 500 mil. And all you do is when those branches are young and whippy, just bend them down and tie them off to the wires that you put up. It's really easy to do, and it's also very, very easy to prune, because these branches, once they've reached their limit, you cut the tips off, and these branchlets coming off them, where your fruit's going to be produced, you can see how far you have to cut them back. You don't want them to grow up past the branch above them, so you just keep cutting them back. Particularly with apples and pears, cut them to develop spurs. Don't cut the spurs off, but cut back your extra growth, and you become an expert on it really, really quickly, because you can see what's growing in the wrong place. And it's nothing. There's no problem with having the same, the whole thing the same variety. But do remember that's going to give you um, all the fruit being the same variety and ready at the one time. If you're hoping to foray into having a go at grafting, um, apart from the obvious ad of come and see us down the orchard, we're grafting 6 months of the year and we're happy to teach people, but also too, apples and pears are the easiest things to start grafting on. So look at some YouTube videos and do some grafting and start to put on other varieties. Okay, you can buy not just off us, off plenty of places online too. You can buy scion wood to put that extra variety on, and you graft that on as close to the trunk as you can, because if you put it out here on the end, you're going to be stripping everything off that branch until the graft for the rest of the life of the tree. Okay, so cut off here, you whip and tongue, normally you graft onto there, and off you go, lots of different varieties. Any espalier questions? You're on mute.
That'll teach me. That nothing specific. There's a question from Mandy about which orchard you referenced. That was the
Werribee
Werribee
Park Heritage
Heritage
Orchard. Yeah.
Orchard. Yeah.
We're not a commercial orchard, and we're about saving heritage varieties. And that for that reason, if you walk down, say, our peach row, every single tree is a different variety. We do get quite a lot of fruit at times, but our purpose is to grow wood for grafting for other people to put those trees in their backyards, so those varieties aren't lost forever. There's no point in just us having it. We need to get it out there, which is why we sell the trees so cheap, so we can keep the orchard going, but also get the trees out there to the public.
Rupa's wondering, how do I espalier a young pear that I bought from Werribee Park in September last year?
Just establish that straight up structure to the height you need, and then just start bending your branches when they're young and whippy, bend them down to some wires. So what I normally do is put a couple of star pickets in. If we look at this diagram here, I use a couple of star pickets and then run the wires at 300 mil spacing. However, with star pickets, as you tighten the wires, you'll pull the top in, which will make the lower wires slacken off. So you need something solid as a spreader, or you can continue a wire down to a stake, so you can tie them off that way. If you've got a brick wall there that you can screw into, then that'll do very nicely.
And Scott, they've confirmed that there's no branches yet, so it's just obviously the
I've got some advice on that coming up.
lovely.
Okay, we're going to look at the marvelous world of bud activation shortly.
Let's do
How are
that.
we going for time, Beck? We've got
Got about 20 minutes, but I think if it's okay with you, Scott, we'll go up to 8:30, and then if there's still more questions, I can stop the recording and we can answer a few more after.
right. The pruning after dark session.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, that's fine. Um, so the pear tree, yep, no worries. We'll look at bud activation, but also when it gets to the height, the ultimate height of the central leader, this one, when you cut that top off or bend it over as one of your branches, so it becomes horizontal, then that will also encourage side growth. But there's other things you can do. Look, some grafters will just graft the branch directly to the trunk, and that's quite effective. It's a more difficult graft because this space in behind it is very hard to get your grafting tape wrapped around and keep all the bad things out. So I tend to get a branch in place and then graft it across when I get the material to do that. And which means if you're buying the stuff, then depending on its rarity, you can put an extra variety on for $5 to $15. From us, it'll be about $5, I think we're charging now. But if it's from a friend's tree, which several of your branches should be at least, if they're nice stuff. Otherwise, you're friends with the wrong people. So it's going to cost nothing from a friend's tree. Right? And you don't have to have every variety being a different one. My apple tree, two of the branches are Stamen's wine sap because that's my favourite apple. And on my pear tree, I've just found out that I love Nashi, not the supermarket ones, but the homegrown tree ripened ones. I love them absolutely so much that I'm starting another tree that's just going to be Nashi because once you get past those, the supermarket varieties, which are a very limited range of varieties, generally two or maybe three if you can include Yali, the Chinese one. Getting it like I've got at the moment I'm eating Hosui, a Korean variety, and it's just superb. Perfumey, but in a good way. So I'm getting into that at the moment. That's my next. I keep changing things all the time just because, I've got access to the stuff, so why not? And look, keeping that in mind too, I had a big overgrown apricot tree in my backyard that produced enormous amounts of fruit, but it was so big that I got very little of that fruit. The birds got most of it. And these days, the Queensland fruit fly will probably get quite a bit of it too. So I cut that whole tree down, and in its place, I now have 5 espalier trees, and the star pickets between those. Each of those star pickets has a different variety of grapes growing up it, and I've got an extra garden bed in the middle of it all, facing, and it's all faces north. That's a sun trap. So by removing one overgrown tree, I've got, well, if you multiply it out, when it reaches ultimately what I'm aiming for, it's going to have more than 50 varieties of fruit in that space and some nice pumpkins in the middle.
Sounds amazing.
So it's worth considering biting the bullet and taking that big tree out or cutting it back a lot. All right. Any questions?
Best position for an espaliered tree.
Um, to the side is the general answer. In other words, it's designed to produce while not taking up very much space. So it's going to be over towards the fence. If you put it on the north fence, then the fence itself is going to be shading it, and that may or may not be a problem depending on the variety. It often can be a problem. There's tricks to get around it. Actually, you can paint the house outside wall white to reflect, and that gives you an enormous amount of light. It's quite surprising. Um, for the ones that need a heap of sun, then if you put them on the south fence, which is facing north, then they're going to get sun. However, I initially did that, and when I first started setting this garden up 30 years ago, and then as I learnt more and bought more plants and so on, I realised that it was an absolute waste because I had all apple trees along that fence, and they're dormant all winter, and that spot is the spot that gets sun all winter. So I got rid of those trees and I replaced them with citrus, which need that sun all year. And I've shifted my apples round to it's probably the east to northeast fence. So they're getting well and truly enough sun. And that's working really well. So look, anywhere there is sun, and remember that if it's something you got grown a bit taller than the fence, it may grow slow until it gets up into that sun. And where you're looking for where the sun goes and where the sun doesn't go, you'll need to go out several times during the day. The fact that there's shade on the ground doesn't mean anything. It's the fence or wall that needs to have the sun on it. So that's what you should be looking at. Is the fence getting the sun? And look, I've got a range of trees growing on the south side of the house that are in shade for most of the day. They're not high producers, but there's general things like elderberries and grapes and babacos and a few other things there. And I'm making good use of the space. And if there's no sun at all, well, that's where you put your worm farm. Any questions?
No, I think we're okay to move
Move
along.
on. Okay. Now, a few tips and tricks. Now, the person before that was asking, saying their pear tree had no side branches. What we do is called a bud activation, and this works on pretty much any tree or plant, including ornamentals and your hydrangeas or anything like that. But if you look down along the branch and find a bud that hasn't shot before, so not a bud where there used to be a branch or a small twiglet, but an actual bud that has never sprouted. And then just above that, and this needs to be done when the sap is flowing, when the tree is actively growing. If you do it in winter on a dormant tree, then the cut will just heal up and nothing will happen. But if you do it in the spring coming up, that's a great time to do it. So what we're doing is we're doing a cut just above the bud and taking out, I'm cutting right into that white bark and then scooping down to take out that piece. So we'll right down onto white bark and you can just see the bark and the xylem and phloem, the all the living parts of the tree. Whereas we get into the xylem in the middle, um, into the transport vessels, then they're not living. So we get right down to those. So we're interrupting the sap from just going straight up like that, and we're redirecting into this bud. Okay, and that'll encourage that bud to absolutely take off. Now I remember about 15 or so years ago, I learnt this at the orchard from someone, and on a Saturday, and then on the Monday, I tried it out on a friend's fruit tree because she was asked me how she could get more branches to graft some stuff on, and I did two bud activations, and they both worked. I was so impressed with myself that day. You wait till you do your first graft that takes. Oh, I'll tell you what, uh, you, you are a god amongst mortals if when you get your first one going. My first ever graft was an apple tree. It was a Mutsu Japanese variety of apple, and because it was on an established tree with an established rootstock, it produced 5 apples the first year, and very nice apples they were. Okay, so that's a bud activation. It works on just about anything. On some of your larger, older trees further down, you'll have to sort of feel around. Some, it's very clear, like on this fig branch here, but others, you just got like cherries and that. You just sort of look at there'll be a horizontal stripe of about a centimetre, and you just feel around and you'll feel a bump towards the middle of it. That's your bud. But if, as an example, if like on over on this one here, these buds here have already been used. So there's a branchlet or a leaf that's grown there and it's gone now. So you can't activate it. There is no bud. Now you don't have to do just one bud at a time. If you want to do two or three, and then when they take off or most of them take off, then you just select back to the one that's heading in the direction you want. This is a very reliable method, but the lower down the tree, the more reliable it is, because as you get higher up, you're going to get that apical bud tending to take over again and keep on heading up and up. No, but it does work really quite reliably if you do it when the sap's flowing. Any questions on that particular one?
No, not at this stage.
I hope that's because you all understand it really well. Okay, now a few other things. You see this lemon in a pot here, and it's you could say yes, it's a spaleo, it's an informal spaleo, and this was at the big green shed, $180. Now that's about a bit above knee height. It's already filled this bit of treated pine trellis, and all they've done there is get those green uh, clip tapes, and they've just tied it all back. It's about 20 minutes work, and they're charging $180 for it. And already it's filling this trellis, and so you've got to redo it and know how to redo it. So don't buy them. They're a rip-off. Just get a regular old lemon, which is what they've done, or whatever tree you want to do, and just keep spreading it out. If you want to do it informal like that, cover a wall with citrus, just all tied back. Put some large gauge mesh that you can easily put your hand through. Put that up on the wall, about 10 mil off the wall, just with a bit of wood top and bottom, and just keep tying it off. And if anything gets in the way too much, you can cut it off. But basically, you can 2D a citrus and most other trees really, really easily for a lot less than $180. Now, look, sometimes multi-graft trees um, with all different varieties of fruits on them and a spallier. Sometimes they are worth $180 because the work's been put into them, the skilled labour, and they've had to be kept in the nursery for several years until they're ready for sale and established. That's fine. $180 will be a bargain for those. This isn't. And they do an olive tree like this as well. Sorry if anyone works for Bunnings. I like the people at Bunnings. The company, yeah. Oh, I said the B word. I meant the green shed. Okay. Now, how do we graft other varieties onto our side branches? If you have a look here, this is my preferred method. That's called a whip and tongue graft. Um, if you go on YouTube, Jay Sakadura does some great videos on that. I'll try and remember to put that on the notes, that name, but capital J, capital S, Akadura. But there's a lot of other great videos as well. What I like about his is English is not his first language, and so everything tends to be very clear and concise, and he knows what he's doing. So that's a whip and tongue graft. At the orchard for our grafting onto rootstock, that's nearly the only method that we use, simply because we've got people coming through as volunteers and we don't have the facility for them all to get trained up in several different methods, such as bud grafting and so on. And this is the one I talked about before when you graft. Where's my cursor gone? No wonder they call it a cursor. This is where there is no branch, and rather than waiting to get one to grow, you can graft directly on, which means you could set your espalier up, with say 4 to 8 branches each side, each one a different variety, and you could do it as long as the tree was thick enough. You could do it all in one hit. However, the chances of them all working is reduced. Whereas this, particularly with apples and pears, they'll pretty much always take. But there's no reason not to do it this way. But it is a more difficult graft to do. So it's done like a whip and tongue, but as an approach graft. I've done some on the apricot tree espalier, and actually I did 2 at the same time. One took, one didn't. That's the way it goes. How's questions going there?
No questions about speleo, but are you happy to take some other?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So Helen's wondering about her olive tree that's quite tall and whether there's a rule of thumb, like you said earlier, for a large tree to divide it into quarters and tackle one quarter at a time. Would that be the same for an olive?
And who was that asking?
Helen.
Helen, was it?
Yeah.
But Helen, I can see you. I can see you on the screen nodding. So I can only see 2 people, but you happen to be there, Helen. If you can kill an olive tree, let me know how you do it. Just cut. You can cut it back to a stump above the graft. If it's grafted, it'll come back. I have 2 olive trees that I'm trying to get rid of, and I certainly won't use poisons on them. But there's also things growing close around them. So what I've been doing is drilling into the stump and filling it full of Epsom salts to dry it out. But figs, it's just not working. You could put a 20-litre drum around it with the bottom cut out and just keep a fire burning on them until the stump's gone. But you want to keep it. So Helen's no problem whatsoever with cutting every single bit off of it and just back to a stump or just back to, say, 4 main branches or whatever. If you can kill it, I'll buy you another one.
They're very hardy, aren't they?
Extremely so. Just remember that if it's grafted, identify where the graft is and don't let anything grow below the graft. But yeah, look, olive trees, and of course they don't have specific fruiting sites, so branching is what you need. Okay. One other thing though, with olives, as a side note, my tree, I left it to get too tall for a while, and I couldn't pick the olives from the top. But every year, when they got too ripe, I'd have a pair of black-faced cuckoo shrikes turn up and eat them. And for that reason, and that was the only time I ever saw those native birds, for that reason, I could never bear to cut it down for a very long time. But eventually I just had to. Everything else was sort of, it was stopping me from putting more new things in, and that cannot be allowed to happen. I hope that covers it for you, Alan. Just get in there with an axe and get into it. No problem at all.
And we've got a question about a 10-year-old pomegranate that's never fruited.
Ah, that's I would guess it, unless it's very, very unhappy where it is, like not getting enough sun. I would say feed it with some wood ash, plenty of compost. Go easy on nitrogen, which is basically your bird poo type fertilizers. Don't give it any artificials. Don't give anything any artificial fertilizer. If you want to kill a young citrus tree, give it citrus food granules. You'll kill it every time. Okay, just so look, something like dynamic lifter or any other brand of chicken poo pellets and a bit of compost, that'll cover all your bases. And a bag of chicken poo pellets. The good thing about it is, if you have an argument with their spouse, you can borrow their car to go and get it, and just leave it in the car on a really hot day. It's quite effective, but it's also quite compact and easy to store. Like if you get the big bags, which are more economical, then just put them in a rubbish bin and they're absolutely fine. Smells a little bit when you put it on, but it's otherwise fine. Um, it's unusual that a pomegranate hasn't fruited. Um, there are some ornamental varieties out there, but even they produce small fruit for ornamental purposes. My pomegranate would be probably just come through its third year, and it got a couple of flowers on it this year. What I'd suggest you might want to try is, if you know anyone who's got a pomegranate tree, take some cuttings and put them in a pot. It's really easy to grow pomegranates from cuttings. Just do it early spring's good, but just slightly woody, and just put a few, hand length pieces into one small pot and wait for them to take off. It's not a pollination issue. If it's not producing any flowers, then then it's also not a potassium issue, but it's certainly not pollination either. 5 years is not unheard of, but really for a pomegranate, it should have been fruiting by now, and I'd consider replacing it. But also too, you can halfway ring bark it just to scare the hell out of it, and that often stimulates them into fruiting. You can either do that around the main trunk or some of the major branches. Just cut through the bark in a strip like we did with the bud activation, and only go halfway around the branch. And then on the other side of the branch, um, a little bit further up or down, do another half cut on the other side of the branch. And basically, you're slowing and confusing the sap flow, and it often stimulate the tree into action. It's a bit like when the chooks aren't laying, so you go and hang an axe on the chook yard, and they start laying again. It's amazing how well that works as well. Okay, but certainly, I would say now's the time to, well, next spring is probably the time to deal with it. Give it one more year with some restrictions, like as I've suggested, and if it doesn't work, start up another one, preferably in another spot.
Scott, Lucinda's got a great question about grafting.
Yep.
What month do we collect scion from friends? I believe keeping in the fridge.
Yep.
Then when do we do the grafting?
Okay. There's a whole variety of answers that I'll go through. But also remember too, there are better times for grafting. There is no time when you cannot graft. So if you can get the wood today, graft it today. It's simple as that. Okay, don't worry about any of the rules. As I've said before, there are better times, but if that's when you can get that grafting material, that's when you do it. Having said that, most deciduous trees are grafted when they're dormant. So you cut the rootstock back and you graft a piece of scion on top of it. Okay? Whereas citrus and other evergreens are usually grafted in the spring when they're actively growing before it gets too hot. Citrus, by the way, are really quite a bit more difficult to graft because the young leaves along branches in profile are triangular, which makes doing your matchup quite difficult. And what we do now for them, it's the only thing we graft differently, is we'll cut the rootstock short, put a split down the middle of it, the old cleft graft, and cut the scion like a screwdriver shape that slots straight in, matching up on one side if they're different sizes, or both sides if they're the same size, and then tape it up. That we've found has a 60 to 70% strike rate, which is much better than anything else we've tried. But yeah, they are a more difficult one to graft, but worth it. Yeah, so look, having said, with scion, yes, it's often done when it's dormant, and it's easy to collect it that way. And you can keep it in a Ziploc bag in the crisper for a couple of weeks. If you wax the ends of those scion, we've used stuff a year old at the orchard because we wax all our stuff that we sell, wax both ends, and then we tag them and bag them and send them out to people. Or we keep them in bulk bags in an ever-growing number of refrigerators that we have in our lock-up areas. But look, yes, they might last a year under ideal circumstances, but more or less, the sooner you use them, the better. If you're getting into bud grafting, then that's a whole other thing, and it is more difficult, but not hugely difficult. And you tend to do that when they're growing actively. Having said that, an enormous amount of the stuff that we've grafted at the orchard this year, we've grafted at green, which means we've grafted it when they're actively growing, and we've had an excellent strike rate. All right, so don't get too wrapped up in the time of year. What I would suggest, though, if you have a look at this graft here, which is a whip and tongue like this, we've done, because of the difference in thickness, it's been grafted onto the side, but still whip and tongue, because we've got to match up those cambium layers if you get into grafting. Don't use electrical tape or anything like that. Get some nice stretchy parafilm or buddy tape, that sort of stuff. We use buddy tape at the orchard, which is nice and stretchy, and you don't have to remove it because it breaks down in the UV. Having said that, though, it's quite expensive, but you only need a very small amount. And we cut those back. So we'll graft them on like this one, and we'll cut them back to 2 buds. So rather than leaving the whole length of about 15 centimeters, which you'll get when you buy a piece of scion, we cut it back to 2 buds, so we're not putting too much strain on this connection. Okay, so it's only having to feed 2 buds and keep them alive. Some people even cut back to 1 bud, but we like to increase the odds a little bit, and then we tape over the whole thing. And once it starts to shoot, we can untape it, if depending on the type of tape we use, or with the buddy tape and parafilm, the bud will just push through that tape anyway. And that also means that you can use that same piece of scion to graft another 1 or 2 trees. All
Scott, I'm
right.
just conscious of timing. Were there any
Yep.
other slides that we wanted to go through before we
Let's go through
finish up
that.
and do
That's
questions?
my house, but it developed from there. Apple, pear. Um, that's a list of what I got to show off. The last one I do want to show you, though, is protecting your fruit from birds. A couple of years ago, about 4 years ago now, it became law in Victoria that any netting that you use to protect fruit trees or veggies or anything like that, the aperture size, the holes in it, can't be bigger than 5 millimeters. And this is to prevent birds and bats getting caught in it. Now, bees can't get through 5 millimeters, which means you have to put your netting on after the fruit has set, after the pollination's occurred and the fruit is set, but before it gets ripe enough to interest the birds. And you can individually bag, say, bunches of grapes or individual apples and so on as well. I have a structure much like this, and because I've switched it over to the 5 millimeter from the 10 millimeter I was using, I've put in big panels of 20 mil mesh so the bees can get in and I don't have to take it down again. and I've got chickens living in it. So um, the ground is about as bare as you see in the picture there. And there's Werribee Park Heritage Orchard from one of our days. Okay, that was all the
Fabulous.
slides.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'll like I said, I'll stop the recording, and if people have to head off, that's fine. But if you still have some questions that you wanted answered, feel free to stick around.